Good evening, and welcome back to From the Stacks here on the Cornwall Alliance Facebook and YouTube channels. Great to have you with us tonight. I think we've got a wonderful show for you. We have Holly Fretwell and Jonathan Wood from the Property and Environment Research Center, a wonderful organization in Bozeman, Montana, to discuss with me their recently published study, Fix America's Forests. It's a tremendous study on what are the problems in the nation's forest lands, particularly that have led to the massive wildfires that we've seen over the last few years. Um, Before we get into that, and before we bring them onto the screen for you, I'd like to just remind you who the Cornwall Alliance is. We are a network of evangelical Christian scholars. Roughly a third are natural scientists, climate scientists, biologists, oceanographers, geologists, and others. Roughly a third are economists, especially of development and environment. And roughly a third are theologians, philosophers, ethicists, and ministry leaders. And we work to educate the public and policymakers on economic development for the very poor, on environmental stewardship, and on the gospel of Jesus Christ. We draw on insights from people all over the world, and it's our pleasure to be able to draw this evening on the insights of Holly and Jonathan. Their study, Fix America's Forests, is, excuse me, is available through the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation as our gift when you make a donation of literally any size, doesn't matter how large or small, and ask for it at our website donation platform. Just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply enter promo code 21-05 or the title Fix America's Forests, either way or both, and we'll know what you'd like and we'll be glad to send it to you free. I do have to mention that our supply is limited this month, and so be sure to do that well before the end of the month so that we haven't run out by the time you ask. If we do run out, I'm sorry, we just won't be able to provide one for you that way this time around. But it's a wonderful study, and I'm glad now to be able to introduce to you Holly Fretwell and Jonathan Wood. Holly is, excuse me, is a research fellow at the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana. She works to improve environmental quality through markets and property rights, as does everyone else at PERC. But her particular emphasis for more than 40 years has been on public lands, property property rights, and markets. She's an outdoor enthusiast, and she strives to enhance conservation through cooperation and entrepreneurship. Jonathan is also a research fellow at the Property and Environment Research Center, which from now on we'll just simply call PERC. Great name because it might wake you up like a good cup of coffee. Jonathan is also an attorney at the Pacific Legal Foundation, where he litigates environmental, property rights, and constitutional cases. He's written many law review articles on endangered species, federal lands, and other environmental issues, as well as dozens of articles for the popular press. Holly, Jonathan, welcome to From the Stacks. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Holly, tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get into this work?
Well, I grew up just as an outdoor enthusiast, as you said, and came out to Montana. I grew up in Seattle, came to Montana to go to school, and really fell in love with the outdoors and with Montana and with some of these conservation ideals. I went on through school to get a master's in economics and started to understand the real value of how economics works with the environment, which is a little bit of a different way of thinking than many other people. With that in mind, I found PERC, the Property and Environment Research Center, and started to do some work with them where we really look at free market environmentalism, is what we call it. And it's really a focus on environmental issues and trying to come up with solutions that are coming out of the private sector and coming from private means. And so that's really where my start came from. I spent about 15 years teaching up at Montana State University as well, teaching economics, where I continued to work at PERC and then came back to PERC full-time a couple of years ago and dove back into some of these wildfire issues.
And Jonathan, how about you? What's a little more about your background?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I am a lawyer by day, where I do environmental litigation, but I've been a fan of PERC and a follower of PERC since long before I even went to law school. In my master's degree, I studied free market environmentalism and the role of property rights in promoting the recovery of endangered species in Namibia and other African nations. And so when I went to law school, I wanted to do environmental work, and particularly to discuss and promote property rights as a solution to environmental problems. As a lawyer, you sort of get a little too into the weeds of the conflict sometimes. And I've always appreciated PERC and working with PERC because it lets me highlight the opportunities and some of the solutions that are out there.
Yeah, and I have appreciated PERC for, goodness gracious, from well before 1990 anyway, was when I first saw PERC's work. I've been very much a champion of free market economics since the early 1980s myself. I've written a couple of books in the field and have quoted from, I guess it's now been about 3 different editions of Terry Anderson and Leal's book on free market environmentalism. It's a great concept because it takes into account the importance of private property ownership in environmental stewardship. What too many people forget is that it's really the ownership of property that gives incentive to take good care of it. And so people are constantly wanting government to control things, and they forget that, that incentive of private property ownership just doesn't do so well in government ownership. I mean, this is why we find graffiti in the New York subways and public bathrooms, but not on your bathroom wall at home, right? So I think that it's very important to promote private ownership in environmental stewardship. PERC recently published your excellent new study, Fix America's Forests, Reform to Restore National Forests and Tackle the Wildfire Crisis. What led you to choose Fixing America's Forests as a topic on which to write?
Well, I can start us off with that one. I started this research actually 25 years ago when we created a report called Forests, Do We Get What We Pay For back in 1999. It was sort of an extension off of my master's thesis, but really extending more into looking at wildfire and the health and the condition of our forests, which was all very new for me. I'm trained as an economist, as a political scientist, not in forestry and silviculture. So it was super interesting. And one of the things that really caught me off guard was the density of our forest and these forests that I've learned to absolutely love, and to find out that many of those forests were actually very unhealthy forests because they were so dense. Some of them are very natural in that form, and some of them are not. And so as we dove into that publication, we did a lot of before and after pictures, trying to get people to understand a little bit more about what our forests look like and what our forests historically look like. And so almost 25 years later, we take another look at that, and things really haven't changed that much. And so we decided we really needed to share some of these ideas again and really maybe dive a little bit deeper into what sort of fixes we could actually have. What are the barriers that we're running up against when we're looking at our federal forests, and why can't we actually get some of the restoration and treatment done that we have a pretty good understanding about that will help us actually reduce the risk of severe wildfire. So that was one of the big shifts for us here at PERC, to try to take a look at the forest again and really dive into that information.
Jonathan, was there anything in particular that pushed you? Okay, go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was just wondering if there was anything in particular that pushed you toward it.
I came to the issue somewhat more recently. It was a natural outgrowth of some work I'd been doing on the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, 2 statutes, which are part of the problem and the reason why we haven't been managing our forests appropriately. But the thing that attracted me to forests as an area to focus on is that this is an area where you actually see some bipartisan consensus. People recognize that there's a very visible problem here, and a really strong incentive for people to come together and actually find solutions.
Great. Well, if you could summarize it most briefly, what is the problem with America's forests? What is it that needs to be fixed? And Holly, how about if we start with you?
Okay. The problem is that we have many of our forests on our federal lands, particularly our national forest, are really overly dense. We have this historic management of suppressing wildfire, which has been extremely effective up to a point. And now we have built up the fuels in our forest. We've built up the underbrush in our forest, which is creating a lot more risk for wildfire, and especially severe wildfire. And I want to be clear about this in that wildfire is really an important part of our forest. We want fire in our forest. We don't want to eliminate all fire, but nonetheless, some fires are more natural than other fires. And there are different types of forest. Some forests that have historically burned every 5 to 25 years, and we've actually changed the condition of those forests. We've changed the density of those forests, and we've changed the fuels buildup so that now when those fires burn, they burn really hot and really severe. We have other types of forests that only burn every 150 to 300 years, and those forests are still pretty close to their historic norm. So we do want to separate the different types of forests that exist out there, but those problematic forests are really causing havoc and creating wildfires that are putting people at risk, watersheds at risk, wildlife at risk, and just the clean air that we have as well. And so we wanted to address that problem and think about what that is. In addition to that, we have a lot of people that are moving into those forested lands, so it is putting more people at risk of wildfire.
Jonathan?
I agree with everything Holly said. The way I would summarize it is we took fire-adapted forests, and then through policy we changed them. And we changed them in a way that actually made them worse for wildlife, worse for people, and worse for the environment. The fires we're seeing today are the direct result of the management decisions we made in the past and our failure to respond to them. We could get the wildfire problem under control if we took a more active role in managing our forests to reduce those risks.
How is it, Jonathan, that what we've done in allowing them to become so much more dense by fighting fires early fire suppression, how is it that that's actually been problematic for wildlife itself? I mean, it seems obvious how it's problematic for people in that you get these massive, really, really catastrophic fires that burn so hot and so fast. You can see how that is a problem for wildlife, but is it a problem for wildlife to have the forests so dense in the first place before the fires get them?
Yes, and the reason why is that our forests, the ecosystems were adapted to fire. They needed fire in order to have successional vegetation and other forest types, which were the ecosystems that species had naturally adapted to. And so the loss of that variation within the forest of different types of vegetation and different densities has limited the availability of habitat. And then, as you mentioned, the biggest threat to wildfire, of course, is when you have a catastrophic wildfire that just destroys massive areas that are critical habitat for many endangered and threatened species as well as other wildlife.
Yeah. There's actually a video that Cornwall Alliance offers through our online store called BLUE, which stands for Beautify, Liberate, Utilize, and Enjoy. And I remember one part of it involves an interview with a forester in the Northwest. I believe he's in Oregon. And he points out how the no-cut sort of policy designed to help the northern spotted owl, which is on the endangered list, resulted in such dense forests that the owl, whose wingspan is quite broad, couldn't fly around as well inside these very, very dense forests, and therefore had a tougher time catching its prey. So there was an unintended consequence there. So how widespread is the problem then of the forests just being way too dense? What percentage of American forests suffers from it? Is it mainly in a particular part of the country? Is it as common in, say, the Southeast or the Northeast as it is in the West? Is it as common on private or as public lands? Where is this problem so often? And either one of you can address this, or both of you.
I'm happy to take this one. It is a problem of the West, and it's mostly concentrated on federal land. According to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, or U.S. Forest Service, I apologize, 40% of all of the land that agency manages is in need of restoration, and over 30% is at high or very high risk of catching fire and burning in a catastrophic wildfire. So while there are fires that burn on non-federal land and in other parts of the country, the biggest concentration, the biggest problem is in Western states where federal lands were managed in such a way that we've lost the fire-adapted ecosystems that used to be prevalent.
Holly?
I don't know that I can add much to that. We certainly have some problems in the West. Most of our federal lands are in the West, and so that is where the biggest wildfire problem does exist. You talked a little bit about the private versus the public, and we manage our lands very differently when we're looking at private versus public lands. The fire suppression that we've seen on our national forest is what's causing some of the grave problems that we have right now. If you look to private lands, a lot of our private landowners are really looking to rotational forestry, and so they're managing these lands, they're thinning these lands, they're trying to ensure that they don't lose that timber to burn, and so they are managed very differently and do not have the same problems on those landscapes. We certainly have some private lands of individuals that just own the landscape that don't do a lot of management on those lands as well, and if they're adjacent to a public land that is overly dense, that's really at high risk of wildfire, it's hard to prevent that fire from spreading onto some of these adjacent lands, even if they are managed and have been very carefully managed to try to reduce that risk of wildfire.
Yeah, at the Cornwall Alliance, we're a particularly Christian organization, and so that what you just said there about the federal lands abutting directly on the private lands, under Mosaic law in the Old Testament, if somebody had a fire break out on his land and it moved over onto his neighbor's land, he was liable to make good any damage that happened to the neighbor. Jonathan, as a lawyer on this stuff, is the federal government liable if a fire breaks out in federal land and it spreads wildly because of the mismanagement there and goes onto a private property and destroys forest there? Is the federal government liable for that? Is there a way for people to hold it accountable?
No, although there have been many efforts to try to create that accountability. The position of the Forest Service, and most of the courts have agreed, is that managing national forests is discretionary and it's just not the sort of thing you can sue over. That said, the Forest Service will not hesitate to sue a private landowner if their mismanagement causes a fire and disturbs National Forest Service land. So there's this huge imbalance which causes real incentive problems. From the private landowner perspective, you have an incentive to manage your property because you're liable if there's a fire and you cause harm. But generally, the Forest Service has not been made liable for those kinds of harms.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. In the last few years, and you've referred to this, both of you already, really catastrophic wildfires have occurred in the West, especially in California, and that's gained a lot of public attention. The initial causes of the fires are pretty well understood. Lightning strikes, campers careless with campfires, sadly arson in some cases. Whatever they are, the initial cause has to involve ignition. But what turns an ordinary wildfire into a deadly conflagration that might consume hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of acres and hundreds of homes and even kill people? What makes the difference?
The topography of where the fire is taking place is one thing. Just if you're on a steep slope and fires move differently, the wind, the weather patterns certainly have a huge impact into how that fire is going to move. I think one of the biggest things that we see right now is that we have so many people that are moving into these landscapes. We have over 46 million acres of subdivision or homes moving into what we call the WUI, the Wild Urban Interface now, which is over the last 20 years. And that's something like 40 million homes. So we have people that are actually moving into the risk of wildfire, and with the idea that they're going to be protected. So we're in some ways subsidizing these individuals by protecting them when we have all this fire suppression. But it's certainly putting a lot of people at risk of those wildfires.
Okay. Jonathan? You want to add
anything?
anything?
I agree with everything Holly said. Fires are opportunistic. They exist where there are fuels. In the most catastrophic wildfires, are because there are people around. The land is valuable, the homes are valuable, and there are lots of ways for a wildfire to cause a lot of destruction.
All right. And a lot of people, including President Biden and California Governor Gavin Newsom, have really pointed to global warming or climate change as the reason for these unusually large fires, or at least in modern times, unusually large fires. How does climate change compare in terms of how it contributes to these fires with these other factors that you've named?
You know, climate changes, and it definitely has an impact on the fuels that are in the wild or in the forest, right? So it's drying those fuels out. It's making those fuels more likely to ignite when a spark does arise. But climate change is a really long-term problem that we may have, and wildfire is something that we need to address right now. We can address the wildfire risk that we're looking at right here and now, and climate policy isn't really going to have any impact on those wildfires that we're seeing now. What we need to do to change the dynamics in our forest right now is to get in there and do some sorts of restoration and some sorts of treatments, and to try to reduce the risk of those severe fires that are taking place.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I'll add, it's unfortunate that so much of the debate is over what is the biggest cause, when what we should be asking is, what are we going to do to make next year's wildfire season not as bad as this year? And there's only one solution, to actively manage our national forests so that they are not creating the same risks that they are today.
Good point. I mean, it seems to me if the choice is, am I going to minimize the risk of a really bad fire in my home by trying to control the humidity and the temperature of the air around my home, or by making sure that I don't have, electrical problems where we're going to wind up with shorts that ignite the frame of the house or something like that. It seems to make a whole lot better sense to control those things that are fairly easy and local to control, and not so much the things that are extremely difficult and more the surroundings than the real direct problem. Well, I really enjoyed reading Fix America's Forests, and I also learned a lot just about forestry in general while I was at it. For instance, I found out why in these two photos of the same place at different times, the bottom photo showed the forest in better health and less susceptible to catastrophic wildfires than the top one, even though, to me, a non-specialist, I look at that top photo and I say, gee, look at all that green. That's really gorgeous. And the lower one, there's bare ground. There's not nearly so much green in there. Why is the top photo a photo of an actually healthier forest than the bottom one? Jonathan, how about you go first this time?
Sure. So one of the reasons is resources. The more vegetation you have growing, the more smaller trees you have trying to grow, they're taking away resources that otherwise would be sustaining and helping larger, older trees, which most people value more. The other reason, as we were discussing earlier, is wildlife. Native American tribes managed these forests through fire to promote wildlife, which became adapted to a certain forest type, and denser forests are less accommodating to many of the species that are there.
Okay. You want to add anything, Holly?
Yeah, the Ponderosa pine forest that we're looking at there is one of these types of forests that burns every 5 to 25 years. And so in that bottom picture, you're actually looking at where that fire would actually go through and burn all those trees and what we would call fuels or ladder fuels that are shown in that upper picture. So that's more of a historical norm. It's looking at those that typical forest we might have seen 100 years ago. What happens is when we don't allow those fires to come in, we get all these fuels built up, we get little saplings that come in, and then when a fire does start, it's able to climb up those trees and up into the canopy of the forest and create this huge severe fire. Our Ponderosa pine forests are actually very thick barked, and so when a ground fire comes in, they can live through that fire. The huge severe wildfire that we might see that moves up and into the canopy, they're not able to sustain that. But we do need to be aware that there are some differences. If we're talking about a high elevation forest, and we can even have high elevation ponderosa pine, or more typically high elevation lodgepole pine, those are the forests that burn every 150 to 300 years, and you expect them to be really dense and really leggy and to have all these fuels. And when they do burn in these catastrophic severe events. They've become catastrophic more to us in today's world because of the people that have moved in, and we have all these homes, and so the cost of that wildfire is much greater than it otherwise would be. But we need to be clear that there's different types of treatment for that type of forest than there would be for the forests that have actually changed in their condition over time because they've missed a fire cycle or 2 or 3.
Okay, you just prompted me to do a little quick thinking on my feet, so to speak here, Holly, by the reference to the high altitude forests. Would I be right in thinking that with a high altitude forest, you're more likely to be dealing with very steep slopes anyway, and that therefore you're also, fire tends to go upward, heat travels upward. And so if you're dealing with really steep slopes, pretty soon you come to the summit and there's not really anywhere left to go. So you're not likely to have that spread over vast, vast areas where you would on lower altitudes without the steep slopes. It just spreads and spreads. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. Does that make any sense, or am I crazy? And don't feel bad about telling me I'm crazy either.
You're actually moving beyond my expertise. I'm not a fire behavior specialist. Some of these high altitude fires can get really big. Winds can make a difference. We saw last year here in Bozeman, Montana, we had a fire that went up and over the ridge and right down and down into to the homes and the subdivisions below. So it really depends upon the wind and the weather and what's happening at that point in time. Fire behavior is hard for me to predict. I know we have lots of people out there that are doing a pretty good job of predicting it to try to help reduce the damage that's done. But clearly we don't have a great control over it when it gets really big and just into that severe level of fire. But again, I think it's important for us to think about the types of treatments that we would do in those types of forests would be very different, and you wouldn't necessarily call them restoration. Our report is really focused on forests that we can do some form of restoration, and that is trying to bring it back to a more historical range or a historical norm. And the high elevation forests, to try to mimic wildfire in those forests, first of all, they may not have missed any fire cycles, so they may be in the condition that they have been in, historically and normally. And if we want to try to do some treatment to reduce the impact of wildfire on people that have moved into that area, we can think about doing some thinning or some, clearing out some small areas, or even, heaven forbid I say the word a clear cut, that would be more mimicking that disturbance that type of a forest would normally see.
Yeah, clear cut is one word that really scares off a lot of people, and yet in those interesting circumstances, that can actually turn out to be better than selective cut. There's so much that depends on really understanding the different ecosystems, the different climes, the different locations and whatnot, different species. You've referred, both of you, a bit to historical norms, to history, to the past. And a lot of folks, think of these recent, the last 3 perhaps fire seasons as just, way off the charts, setting huge new records for acreage burned, for number of fires, and so on. And yet, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that actually, in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s, we had far more fires, burning far more acres than we've had even in these last few years, and we had a huge lull, diminishment of the number and acreage of fires in America from the, say, the 1940s through 1970s into the early 1980s. But of course, history is longer than, the 19-teens to the present, too. And going much farther back in history, there are very different things entirely. You mentioned that large and destructive wildfires are becoming more common across the West, with new records set almost every year. Now, we at the Cornwall Alliance, we focus a lot on climate change, and claims are common there that, well, this or that month is the hottest month on record. But it's rarely mentioned that the record in mind might only go back to 1979, when we began measuring global temperature by use of satellites instead of just thermometers on the ground. Or somebody will say, look, this has been Arctic sea ice is at its lowest on record, though it's rarely mentioned that the record just goes back into the 1960s when satellites started measuring sea ice extent. But observational records indicate that sea ice was lower in the 1930s, and so on. So when you write of new records set almost every year, how far back does that go? How do wildfire sizes today compared with sizes before, say, the late 19th century, when people first began concerted efforts to contain and extinguish fires rather than they're burning freely till they either ran out of fuel or were extinguished by seasonal rains? For example, there was an article published in Forest Ecology and Management. I almost said and Mismanagement. Forest Ecology and Management in 2007, Stevens et al., called Prehistoric Fire Area and Emissions from California's Forests, Woodlands, Shrublands, and Grasslands, that found that before European settlement and the start of fire suppression, wildfires burned on average 4.5 to 12 million acres every year in California alone, which puts last year's 4.5 million acres, which was reported as a record, at the low end. So how do we compare this more recent time with the sort of interim time, the fire suppression period, and then back to the pre-fire suppression period? And why would we prefer one over another? Holly?
Yeah, I think those are really good questions. When we look at what the statistics on wildfire that's actually published right now by the National Interagency Fire Center, they start that data now in 1983. And they do that because there's a different, they're using a different metric from 1983 forward so that they're continuing this consistent sort of measure of wildfire acreage over time. And that's where you really do see that, you know, in the 80s and the 90s, we have closer to 3 million acres on average per year. And then in the early 2000s, we're getting up to 6 million acres per year on average, up to about 7 million acres per average in the last decade. What we look at, if you see other graphs and charts of wildfire and acreage of wildfire over many, many years, is you see a U-shaped curve. And you actually see that, you know, as you were saying, in the 30s and 20s, you see this extreme amount of wildfire that exists there. Apparently, part of that is because we've had prescribed fire was counted in some of those wildfire acreage. So that data, you need to be a little careful with how to use it, and I don't have a really good answer for that. But let's go all the way back to the 1800s, and we know that we had a lot of wildfire across the landscape. You know, the 1910 fires, 3 million acres across Idaho and Montana. Those were more historic. We know about what they used to call the gray ghost in Oregon, because they were constantly burning, yeah. And Native peoples, you know, were just used to those fires, and they would burn many, many acres just to clear the landscape for various reasons, whether it was because they were trying to create wildlife habitat, or they wanted to be able to see longer distances, or to grow different types of crops. So they were also burning a lot. So I don't know that you can come up with a time period and you say, this is where we should be. And I think that's the problem. We continue to try to say, this is what it should be. It should be some historical norm. I think what we really need to find out and think about is, what do we want for our forests? What is the outcome that we want? If we want some forest products, if we want some ecological health in some sense, and we need to define what that is it, you know, habitat for mule deer? Is it habitat for the goshawk, or for the spotted owl, or for the you know, the antelope? All those would be different types of forest management to get there. In fact, if you go back to Flagstaff back in the early 1800s, it was called Antelope Springs because so many antelope run through there. That forest is so dense now that there are no more antelope that are going through it. Instead, it is now habitat for the goshawk, which likes that really tight, dense canopy type forest. So what is the better forest type there? You know, that is a human decision, and we need to decide what that is. And we have pretty good tools to be able to manage for that once we know what it is that we're actually trying to get to.
Yeah. Jonathan, we have a comment from one of our viewers, Guy Takamatsu, who says, I've read that Japan has been practicing forest thinning for years. I also heard that some European countries also practice forest thinning. Are you aware, are there some lessons that the US can take from Japan and Europe on this very issue?
That I don't know. That's beyond my expertise. I'm not familiar with their management approaches.
All right, I respect that kind of an answer. Yeah, so maybe we need to get Guy Takamatsu on the program sometime, but he's been doing some reading on it at any rate. Excuse me. Of course, we don't want to go back to the routinely huge wildfires of the pre-fire suppression era. But so long as there's plenty of fuel, it seems hard to avoid that. So what do we do to undo the over-fueled situation in our forests? Jonathan, you want to start off on that?
Sure. So Holly and I in our PERC report focus on restoration, which can take different forms depending on what type of forest you're dealing with or what the local desires and needs are for that forest. But often will involve things like removing excess fuels, engaging in watershed and stream restoration, trying to manipulate the forest so that it has the type of vegetation you want, but not the vegetation you don't. In particular, there are concerns about disease and insect infestations that can wreak havoc on forests and leave a lot of dead trees standing, which are just fuel for catastrophic wildfires. So it varies a lot, but key to it is thinking in advance, what do we want from our forests and what do we have to do today so that the forests don't burn tomorrow and we get all the things that we actually want from them.
Okay. Holly, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just sort of extend that further and say not only what do we want from our forests today, but we need to manage them to reduce the fuels in there today, but it's an ongoing process. If we do some restoration type treatment in our forest, it's not, one and done and we can just move on and forests are going to be beautiful. We either need to allow some of those ground fires to come back in or continue to manage those forests. And I think that continued management is really provides us an opportunity to allow markets to function here and to think about how we can actually add value to some of the products that are coming out of the forest. We have forests in Washington, Western Washington in particular, that are very productive. We still have a lot of the milling infrastructure that exists there. So we can do this restoration and actually have that timber removal help pay for that restoration. That's not true across all forests. We have some other forest areas that have commercially valuable timber, but we don't have the milling infrastructure. And so it's hard to get individuals to invest in that if we don't have a longer term outlook. And then we also have some forested areas that really don't have a lot of added value to the materials that need to be removed. So we need to come up with other mechanisms and other tools to remove some of those timbers.
Thank you. A viewer on our YouTube channel, Liam Venner, says Fort McMurray, Alberta's recovery from a devastating fire included clear-cutting a perimeter around the town and thinning the adjacent forests. Sounds like a pretty sensible thing to do. Sounds right in line with what you all are doing. I have fallen down on my job because I really should have reminded our viewers a little while ago that for the month of May, as our way of saying thanks for a donation to the Cornwall Alliance of literally any size, we will be glad to send a free copy of Fix America's Forests, the report that we're discussing here in tonight's program, as our way of saying thanks for that. To request your copy, all you need to do is go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments section, simply write in promo code 21-05 or the title Fix America's Forests. And while your donation will be 100% tax deductible, we will be glad to send you a copy. I do need to mention that our supply this month is a little short of what we usually are. And so you need to ask quickly. If we run out, then I'm sorry, we won't be able to provide that for you. But I trust that you'll act quickly for that. Now, Jonathan, Holly, you speak of forest restoration as the main solution to catastrophic fires. And I confess the sort of intuitive sense of what forest restoration would mean, in my mind anyway, is returning a forest to its natural state. But that actually is what led to the massive fires of the pre-fire suppression era, and that's clearly not what we want, despite the fact that a whole lot of environmentalists tend to think, well, nature knows best. What's best is nature untouched by human hands. So you've talked a little bit about we need to try to figure out what it is that we want to get out of our forests. Maybe you could mention several options, several alternatives that can't necessarily be served by the same piece of forest, and so how we would manage differently to gain those alternatives. Holly, you want to take that one to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can just come back to the idea of the different forest types and say if we're looking at a forest that has missed some forest cycles, then it does make a lot of sense for us to get in there, restore that forest, and do some commercial thinning, remove some of those small diameter timbers, and to try to remove those from the forest. If we're talking about a high elevation forest with a historical fire of every 150 to 300 years, we do want to do a very different treatment, and I don't think we would call it a restoration; we'd call it a treatment. But we can again get in there and do some of that, some thinning, maybe again doing larger areas of thinning. You don't have to go to a full clear cut. I know that's not very politically correct anymore, and we'd have a lot of opposition to that. But that would, in many senses, actually help mimic some of what the fire would have done. I think what we actually see happening, which is super cool, is that we have all these collaborative groups that are in these regions that are at really high risk of fire, and they are getting together and they're saying we need to do something now, and they are creating the plans and actually motivating the Forest Service and enabling them to get into the forest and on the ground to get this stuff done. And that is a really important part of moving forward and getting some of this forest restoration done, is getting people in the local community that are on the ground and helping them help us understand, or help the Forest Service understand exactly what they want and what the benefits of doing this restoration treatment is, and motivating that action.
Jonathan?
I completely agree. And just to add on to that, one of the great things about these private voluntary solutions, which we go into quite a bit of detail in the report, is that it fixes some of the problems we've been trying to talk about. Local communities that have a vested interest in making sure our forests are healthy are in the best position to weigh in and invest in the solutions that can restore or properly manage our forests. And so you get the incentives aligned correctly. That the people that would bear the costs from a catastrophic wildfire can avoid those costs by investing today. The key is to remove some of the barriers. It makes it more difficult for the Forest Service to work with states, local communities, tribes, and private groups that otherwise would happily service.
Just again, sort of thinking as I was listening to you, I'm thinking to myself, okay, so it's sounding to me like some of the keys to this are that as much as possible, decision-making needs to be in the hands of private owners of property rather than in the hands of government. And that a second one would be that as much as possible, the decision-making should be as localized as possible. Let the folks near the place determine what gets done with the place, because they're the ones who have to live with it and who value it more than somebody, a continent away. For instance. So those are some takeaways that I would get. And then besides that, we're going to talk a little later near the end of the program about, what can ordinary folks do who aren't, say, members of state legislatures or the Congress or hold any public office at all. What can ordinary folks do to help bring about good solutions? And one of the things that I would say is just that they could read your report, Fix America's Forests, because as you mentioned, Jonathan, it is loaded with examples of what private people are doing. Private groups, not just owners of their own land, but groups that get together and work with each other. I found it very inspiring, frankly. So that's one thing that we can aim for. Can you sort of walk through the steps of forest restoration? How does it progress? And we'll go ahead and use that word restoration here, though sometimes maybe treatment might be better. But let's stick with the places where restoration seems the preferred mode. What are the steps of that? Holly,
Jonathan,
go
I'm going to
ahead.
let you, yeah, no, I'm going to let Jonathan take that one because he's really
Okay.
our expert thinking about sort of the NEPA planning and processes that have to go through to even allow us to get on the ground. I can start with saying that the agency has a lot of mapping and inventorying and areas that we know are high priority areas to get something done. But it takes a lot more than just knowing where it is that we need to get something done and being able to go do it. There's a process that Jonathan, I think, can walk us through probably better than I.
Sure, happy to. So obviously it depends somewhat on local conditions, but generally anytime the Forest Service is involved, it's first going to have to navigate the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires a study of the environmental impacts of a project. That depending on how big the project is or what the Forest Service wants to do, that may be a minor inconvenience that only delays things by several months, or it may be a huge inconvenience that delays projects by 3 or more years. And one of the things we found in the report was in looking at different projects across project types, so comparing forest restoration to things like mining plans. Forest restoration tends to be bogged down by NEPA more than other projects. So the delay to produce the environmental report for forest restoration project takes about 50% longer than mining projects and other similar types. So the paperwork delay, the bureaucracy really is a serious obstacle. It can get even worse if you have an endangered species in a particular forest. Then you have to also comply with the Endangered Species Act, which requires the Forest Service to consult with another federal agency about whether the project will impact it or its habitat. And in much of the West, this creates a moving target problem. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which oversees most of the West Coast and Montana and a few other states, has basically said that anytime a new species is listed or habitat is designated, you have to not quite start over from scratch, but almost start over from scratch. You have to redo the analysis based on those changes, so that if you have a project that from idea to implementation takes 10 years, if anything happens in that time, you're facing much longer delays. And then finally, once the Forest Service reaches its final decision and says, we've done all the analysis, we've checked off all the boxes and done all the paperwork, and we're ready to go forward with the project to restore this forest, there's a risk of litigation. Almost anyone can take the Forest Service to court saying, I enjoy walking through the forest, or I know of a species there that I value. And that too can substantially increase costs for the agency as well as delay things considerably.
I was actually planning on asking next, okay, if it's pretty widely understood that dense undergrowth and too much dead fallen wood are the problem, they're what result in these major conflagrations, and it's pretty obvious that the solution then is to reduce that density, get rid of that extra fuel. What stands in the way of solving that throughout America's forests? Is it costs? Is it political will? Is it competing agendas, competing visions of environmental well-being? Or is it, as you just raised, Jonathan, litigation that just kind of can stretch things out for eternity? I think of a Dickens novel where a court case runs on for about 4 generations. In the very end, there's a few cents left over to give to the heirs. How can we cut the Gordian knot? I mean, is there a way to cut through all of these different competing things and speed up the process? Because obviously, if the process continues as slowly as it's going, I mean, I think was it like 4% of the areas that are in desperate need of restoration are actually getting worked on at this point? And if we continue at that pace, we'll never solve the problem. How can we get rid of some of those obstacles?
You're exactly right. The backlog we face now is a really serious threat. It would take decades at current restoration rates to clear it, and that's assuming that new problems don't arise in the interim. As Holly was saying earlier, this is not a one-time situation. Management would have to be ongoing over the long term. So it would take a very long time to try to deal with this problem. That said, we go into the report in quite a few solutions that could deal with some of the bureaucracy and red tape. And there are other problems that I think Holly can address. But the basic idea behind solving some of the red tape, bureaucracy, and litigation is to encourage more collaboration rather than conflict. Right now, the incentives are wrong. There are really strong incentives for groups to just say no and sue. They have a ton of leverage through those techniques to try to prevent projects they don't like. And through relatively small tweaks to the way that NEPA and the Endangered Species Act work, we could do more to encourage people to come to the table in advance and say, well, this is what I want from the forest. These are my concerns with your project, where there's still time for the Forest Service to take that into account and improve the project without the years and years of delay and expense and risk of litigation.
Yeah. Holly, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, in addition to some of the regulatory red tape that exists there, we have contracts and contractual regulations and restrictions that are not allowing the Forest Service to have some flexibility to increase the length of contracts. Most of the contracts that the Forest Service works with right now are about 5 years long. They do have the ability to create contracts up to 10 or 20 years when they're looking at restoration efforts. But we really need to think about that longer term contract to enable people to be willing to invest in some of the infrastructure that we need. As I was talking previously, we have some regions that have good milling and processing infrastructure so that there's pretty good value coming out of those forests, and other regions where we just don't have that infrastructure. And the private sector is not willing to invest in that right now because of the risk. If we have the risk of litigation, if we have the risk of we only have this 5-year contract, we're not going to get a return on our investment in just 5 years. We need 10 or 20 years to do that. We need to allow the flexibility within the Forest Service to manage for these contracts and to work with people at a longer term scale. And a lot of our collaborative groups are starting to create those programs and working with the Forest Service. These are federal lands. We have to work with the federal government in some form, but creating those contracts and allowing those individuals that are at the local level that really understand the problems and are really the beneficiaries of doing some of this treatment, having them help create some of these projects and determine how these projects are going to look, I think is super beneficial. And we're seeing more and more of that, but we still have these restrictions and regulations and limits on the flexibility and the authorities that the agency has, that if we can expand those a little bit, I think we can get a lot more done in a shorter period of time. And if we can save some of the money that we're spending on NEPA, we can spend that money somewhere else, right? That NEPA problem is not only just that it's taking a long time, but if we're spending $500,000, $1 million every year on one NEPA project, then that's money that we can't spend to actually get stuff done on the ground. And it's really important for us to start balancing that and making sure that we're actually able to get more done on the ground while still considering the environmental impacts that are taking place.
I want to remind all our viewers that our guests tonight are Holly Fretwell and Jonathan Wood, the co-authors of a wonderful study called Fix America's Forests. And they're both research fellows with the Property and Environment Research Center, or PERC, in Bozeman, Montana. I've admired PERC's work for over 30 years now, and I would encourage all of you to go to perc.org, that's PERC.org, learn more about their work, sign up for their email newsletters, read the studies that come out of there. It's a tremendous organization, really, really helpful to me on many different issues. Now back to our discussion. There are both recreational and industrial uses for America's forests. Historically, they've been an important source for wood for housing and furniture construction, and a source for wood for paper manufacturing. But from the late 1980s onward, there was a huge drop in harvesting of wood from our forests. You have a chart in your report that shows that. Why did this happen? Either one of you can take that on.
But I can take that. We had a peak in our forest harvest from national forest lands in 1987 at about 12 billion board feet. And we see that climbing increase in harvest over time following World War II, when we were trying to build more homes. We were trying to get many of those military personnel into their own homes. And so we were pushing this, remove timber from the forest, create a forest industry. And the Forest Service was actually set aside to provide a continuous supply of timber for society. What what happened is we started creating these timber targets, and sometimes those timber targets didn't make a lot of sense in an ecological sense. And yet nonetheless, we had these targets that we were trying to hit, that our forest managers were trying to hit. And at some point in time, we had some opposition to that. We had some laws that were passed saying we really need to look at multiple uses, that we want to start thinking about more of the environmental aspects of this. We want to make sure that our forests are providing for wildlife, for habitat, for water quality, for other commodities, as well as for recreation and all sorts of different types of recreation. And so there started to become a little bit of conflict as to what our forests were being managed for. And come to about the 1990s, we also had endangered species that we were starting to see that people were looking at those endangered species and saying, no, you can't harvest here because of the northern spotted owl would be the big one in 1990. And we actually set aside 24 million acres in the Pacific Northwest for that northern spotted owl, so that we were not allowed to harvest timber on that. And that all led to some very different types of management and sort of a paradigm shift for the agency to think about more of ecosystem management. I would say that the peak harvest was probably too much harvest in certain areas, maybe not enough in others, but it wasn't really focused on a good, solid ecological understanding and economic understanding of what the forest can do for us. And now the reduction down to somewhere around 3 billion board feet harvested is perhaps not enough, especially in those areas where we have had fire suppression, and we could actually mimic some of that fire through some timber removal.
I see. Okay. In Fix America's Forests, you call attention to the fact that the U.S. Forest Service spending has shifted from forest management to firefighting. Why has that happened, and what can be done about it? Jonathan first.
I can take that. We refer to the Forest Service often around PERC as the fire service, because if you look at the changing, the makeup of the employees over time, historically it was mostly foresters, the people who could go out and do the work of forest management and forest restoration. But as fires have become the most important issue for the agency, that's fundamentally changed. Today, the agency is mostly made up of firefighters. And in a recent survey of Forest Service managers, the agency personnel reported that, frankly, they couldn't do the type of forest restoration at scale needed today because they just don't have the personnel anymore. Those resources exist in the private sector, they exist in the states. There's really no way, with the way the Forest Service is currently organized, to have this be a federal solution. It has to be a partnership with states and with private parties.
So are you saying in part that if the U.S. Forest Service were to reprioritize from firefighting to forest management, we wouldn't actually need so much firefighting, and we'd see cleaner air from less smoke in the air and fewer economic, aesthetic, and human losses from wildfires? Would we also see expanding supply of wood products like lumber and paper, and hence lower prices for them, which might be really popular when lumber prices are skyrocketing as they've done in the last few months here? How would this renewed emphasis on forest management affect lumber prices, but also the ecosystem services, the air quality concerns, the aesthetic concerns, and so on? What would happen if people were to implement the ideas that you have in your study?
I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important to start at the ground level and really get people that are collaborating, that are working together, to saying these are the things that we really want. That in and of itself is going to help prevent the conflict that we see sometimes with the litigation. It certainly doesn't alleviate all of that, but helps get people on the same page to do the project, to get some of the work done. And every region is a little bit different. Again, in some of these areas, we're going to have some good timber products that are coming from them. In some of these areas, we have these small diameter timber products, but if we could actually build the infrastructure to process and mill some of that small diameter into glulam and CLTs and other things to build these what we call mass timber buildings, we can use that product to help enhance the community both economically and also to get those ecological outcomes that we're looking for with regards to some of those ecosystem services. Again, I think we need to be really careful and look at each place in itself and look at what it is that we're looking for. What do we want from this forest? And then how do we get there? How do we motivate that private investment in that infrastructure? Do we need these longer term contracts? Or how do we, what is it that we want and who's going to be opposed to that so that we can try to have those discussions in advance and get this stuff done at a quicker pace?
Okay. We're really coming close to running out of time. We can be flexible. We are, a web-based deal, so we're not stuck with broadcast, restrictions. But I don't want to go too long. Yet I also don't want to neglect, I think, a really important discussion late in your study. You recommend that states and private property owners can be an important part of the solution to forest management by linking hands well. How does that work? And Jonathan, first anyway, can you give us some specific examples of that? Tell us about particular projects that have succeeded well in particular places.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at the end of your question, you hit on what's really the key point is that states and private landowners are already doing this. The real key is to create reform so that we get more of that. But the model already exists. You mentioned earlier in our report, we have quite a few examples where people are already working together to improve the health of our forests. So I commend that to the viewers. The one example I'll give that I think is my favorite is the Northern Arizona Forest Fund, which was started a couple years ago, has already raised several $millions to pay for forest restoration, a handful of national forests in Northern Arizona. And the motivations are all over the place. It really represents the richness of why our national forests are valuable to us and where the incentives to manage them properly could come from. So for some participants in the fund, it's about water quality. If you run a local water utility, you care a lot about whether you have storage capacity, how much you have to pay to treat water, and fires wreck those things. But for others, it's about outdoor recreation. So there are a lot of outdoor recreation companies that want to preserve the areas of the forest that they take visitors to, and the only way to do that is to contribute up front to try to tackle this problem. And then also, the state and local governments are also participating. But because you have so many different people coming together with different interests, you get really interesting on-the-ground projects. So some of the projects look more like traditional timber harvesting because that's what's needed and that's what makes sense in that area. Others are about wetland restoration or planting the right trees or removing invasive plants. Like it really does vary. There's no one-size solution, but reforms can enable disparate groups and different people to come together and find what works for them.
Holly, do you have a favorite project?
Yeah, my project is similar and right in line with the Northern Arizona Forest Project. It's the Forest Resilience Bond. And the reason I'm so interested in the Forest Resilience Bond, which is actually a project that's being pulled together by Blue Forest Conservation and World Resources Institute on the Tahoe National Forest, is because they've been extremely innovative. And one of the problems when we're trying to get these projects done is that there's no money up front, right? We need seed money up front to actually start the project before we can have any revenues that are coming from the project. And so what Blue Forest has done is create a resilience bond, a forest resilience bond that actually has this money up front that people are investing in, and that bond is being paid back again by the beneficiaries. And just like Jonathan was talking about, the beneficiaries being the water utility, the local recreation groups, others that are right there, the community that's going to have less fire risk or at least severe fire risk in this area, and they are paying those bonds back over time. And in fact, the Yuba Water Utility, who was part of this first restoration project that Blue Forest has done, has just put up $6 million to continue this project further into the forest. So they have seen great successes on this project. They've expedited the time it would take to get some of this work done from what they expected to be 10 years down to 4 years. And it's just, in my mind, a really hopeful way to see more of this stuff done and to get it done at a faster scale.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, that kind of leads to what is sort of a closing shot for me, and that is I'd like you to tell our viewers what they can do to help move the needle over toward getting more done to take good care of our forests. They're not necessarily members of state legislatures or anything. They're not elected officials at all. They're just private people, and they live all over the country. What can they do that's constructive on this?
Well, I can take that one first. I think that for certain, if you live in an area that is at high risk of wildfire, that you should get involved and be part of one of these collaborative groups and voice your concerns and the benefits that you're looking for. I also think it's really important for people to just understand that wood is a really valuable renewable resource, right? We can use this timber, we can build buildings with this timber, we can use it for building products, and that can actually take us away from some of the fossil fuel intensive products that we use otherwise. And in doing so, we can also be managing the forest, and we can continue to manage the forest, both for ecological outcomes that we're looking for and for economic outcomes that we'd like to see.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Holly said. I think the most important thing to do is to think about why, if you live near national forests or just like our national forests, why they are valuable to you. Because that will start to open up the thinking of where are the potential incentives to do this restoration. And we mentioned in the report, the Forest Service actually has already put together a database to try to figure out where are these opportunities out there, where are there local groups or local businesses or others who are interested and have the capacity to do more. So I would encourage you, if you live near a national forest, to look at that as a potential opportunity for, oh, these are the people I should be talking about, because there actually is an opportunity here. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that you should learn more about the problem. One of the ways to do that would be to go to PERC's website and read a report where, as I said, there are a ton of examples about the different ways that communities and private groups have tried to think about this problem and to address this problem.
Yeah, great. Closing comments from each one of you. What more would you like to say to our viewers? How about start with Holly and then go to Jonathan?
Okay, well, first I'd just like to thank you for inviting us to be part of the program. It's just really wonderful to be able to share some of the ideas that we've been looking at and working on. And I really think that one of the big keys for us is to get a better understanding of what we want from our forest, and for people to look at some of these restrictions and regulations that we have and think about how we can get so much more done if we have additional flexibility, and if we work with partners and we actually allow those markets to function better, to remove some of this timber and to allow us to manage these timberlands over time. Again, thinking about those outcomes that we want, both ecological, environmental, and economic.
Okay, and Jonathan?
And I want to add my thanks. I really appreciate the discussion. It's not often that you get to talk about topics like this for this long, so I definitely appreciated that. I think the other theme that I would highlight is the importance of actually being solutions oriented. I mentioned earlier how disappointed I am whenever this comes up. Politically, it's often about, oh, who's to blame? And the reality is we should probably move past almost all of that and instead be thinking about, okay, we care about our forests. We want them to be healthy and look a certain way and to provide all these benefits to us. What can we actually do to ensure that that happens and that they don't go up in smoke? Great point.
Great point. Well, thank you again, both of you, Jonathan, Holly, for joining us tonight on From the Stacks. It's been a pleasure for me, and you've both kind of referred briefly anyway to the fact that this is a sort of a long-form program, and that's unusual. But that's really part of what Cornwall Alliance is about. I mean, we do publish a lot of short articles and the like, but we really want to offer more serious education to our audience. And it's been really helpful to have you with the depth of your knowledge on the program tonight to help us do that. Thank you very, very much. Next week, our guest will be Vijay Jayaraj, who is a longtime friend of the Cornwall Alliance. He writes frequently for us on a variety of different issues, but especially related to climate change. He is a climate scientist himself. He's going to be discussing with us the impact of climate and energy policy on the developing world. And he's also going to give us a bit of an update on the COVID situation in India, where Vijay lives and where there has been just a devastating surge of COVID over the last few weeks, though it has diminished somewhat over the last roughly 1 week. So we'll get to hear from somebody who's there on the ground. Again, I would remind you that through the end of May, we will, as our way of saying thank you when you make a donation of any size and request it, send you a copy of Holly and Jonathan's wonderful report, Fix America's Forests. To request your copy, simply go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you're filling out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just write in promo code 21-05 or the title of the study, Fix America's Forests. And as long as we haven't run out of copies yet, we will be glad to send you one. Just be sure to make your request before the end of May, because that's when the offer runs out. Thank you again for joining us tonight on From the Stacks. Look forward to seeing you next week. And between now and then, God bless you.